Hey guys, tonight we descend into a world of sandals slapping marble, scrolls rustling like dry leaves, and voices echoing off impossibly ornate walls. You're not a warrior. You're not a philosopher. No, tonight, you're something far more dangerous. You are a low-level Byzantine bureaucrat, and you're about to be assigned to a government committee that takes curtain colors very seriously. Like empire threatening seriously. Picture this. A cool breeze flows through the marble corridors of the Great Palace of Constantinople. Sunlight catches on golden mosaics. But your eyes are fixed on something more pressing. Drapes. Specifically, the deep purple silk ones that hang just inside the imperial audience chamber. They're heavy, rich, and dyed with the most absurdly expensive substance known to your world, Tyrian purple. Squeezed out drop by agonizing drop from sea snails. You don't get to touch those curtains. You barely get to look at them. But today, your department has filed a formal complaint. Another office, those meddling, self-important clowns from logistics, just hung a new set of purple panels in their chamber. The nerve. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your sandals click lightly on the stone. You try not to sweat. After all, you're only here to report on fabric. But the hall is thick with tension. Other officials murmur as they glance toward the drapes in question. Are they really purple? Or just a little eggplant? Does it count as a violation? The scribes in protocol are already preparing a memo that could ruin careers. The first assistant to the deputy master of the curtain archive is on the warpath. You pass him now, red-faced, mustache twitching. He doesn't even nod. In theory, Byzantine officials should have better things to do. The empire, in all its golden complexity, stretches from the Balkans to the eastern sands. Arab armies, Slavic raiders, internal rebellions, they all clamor at the edges. And yet here, inside the palace, it's the hue of a window treatment that may provoke the most heated arguments of the week. That, and the proper protocol for feather plume length on a dispatch courier's helmet. But that's next week's meeting. You reach the chamber. The curtains really are dangerously purple. Not the imperial grade violet that only the emperor can wear, but a deep, luxurious plum that toes the line. It's enough to send the Decoration Oversight Committee into a frothing rage. You're handed a parchment. Your job is to inventory the pigments used, trace their purchase, and, crucially, identify who approved this unauthorized flamboyance. You don't say it out loud, but you suspect this is retaliation for that rug incident last spring. Here's a historical fact that might not surprise you. The Byzantine Empire, for all its glittering domes and theological arguments, had the most complex bureaucracy of the medieval world. Layers upon layers of scribes, officers, inspectors, archivists, and obscure titled officials who governed not just people, but aesthetics. If you think modern office politics are petty, wait until you see a man lose his pension over salmon-colored tassels. Now here's a quirk. The Byzantines weren't just fussy. They genuinely believed that color could represent divine order. Purple wasn't just fancy, it belonged to the emperor. Using it improperly was akin to wearing a crown to a dinner party. There are records, real ones, of artisans being fined, even exiled, for crafting purple belts without license. Historians still argue whether these color restrictions were mainly about sacred tradition or raw political control. One camp says the rules kept power visually centralized. Another suggests it was mostly an elite flex. If you can make everyone else wear beige, your plum cloak stands out even more. You jot your findings on a wax tablet. The curtains are confirmed, dyed with a blend of indigo and mollusk-derived purple. The supplier? A known associate of the Undersecretary for Decorative Affairs. Suspicious. The implication is clear. Someone in that office is playing status games with textiles. The last time that happened, it sparked 3 weeks of passive-aggressive icon rearrangement in the chapel hallway. You pass a trio of younger clerks whispering near a linen-covered table. One of them gestures toward the drapes with a smirk. Maybe it's plum, he says, but it feels like ambition. You roll your eyes. You've heard worse jokes, just last month. Someone replaced all the ceremonial banners in the treasury with ones stitched in taupe. The sheer scandal of that beige rebellion still simmers. As you return to your office, the sun dips low over Constantinople. Seagulls scream across the water, and incense drifts up from a chapel below. You know you'll be back tomorrow. The curtain tribunal is convening. Someone has already summoned a colorist from the Guild of Dyers. And deep inside the bureaucracy's paper-stuffed heart, a war is quietly unfolding, one thread at a time. You shuffle back into your own department, Office of Interior Stewardship, Subdivision of Tapestry Harmony, and sink into the creaky chair behind your desk. The curtain report still clings to your thoughts like a poorly laundered toga. But before you can rest, your superior, Master Theocles, appears beside you, face flushed with indignation. He drops a scroll with a theatrical thwack. Logistics. He spits, as though the word itself were moldy cheese. They've requested additional fabric samples. Velvet, in goldenrod. You don't immediately understand the offense. Goldenrod, to your untrained eye, is just another flavor of yellow. But Theocles leans in with the intensity of a monk deciphering forbidden scripture. Goldenrod, he hisses, is a ceremonial shade, reserved for autumnal processions and harvest parades. They want to use it in the file storage wing. Your job description says nothing about color enforcement, but that hasn't stopped your team from treating it as a sacred calling. You take the scroll and begin to draft your response. As you do, you glance toward the stacks of parchment in the corner. Memos, grievances, swatch samples, thread tension assessments. Your empire floats on a sea of silk and paperwork. Here's a historical fact to make all of this feel more real. The Byzantine administration had over 60 specialized departments by the 10th century. 60. One of them dealt exclusively with measuring weights and lengths. Another monitored grain purity. One oversaw the gold content in coins. And yes, several focused on palace interiors, textiles, and ritual decoration. The point wasn't efficiency. It was hierarchy. Everyone needed to know their place, even if that place involved chair cushion protocol. What you quickly learn, as you pace through the East Wing for your next assignment, is that curtain disputes are never isolated. They ripple outward. The logistics wing's flirtation with goldenrod has inspired the archivists to petition for teal valances. The Naval Correspondence Bureau now wants burgundy blinds to match the ink, they claim, and suddenly, your tiny corner of decorative peace has become the front line of a tastefully colored Cold War. You stop at the Bureau of Regional Maps. Their lead officer, a woman named Damaris, meets you with tired eyes and a dry smile. She gestures toward a recent addition to their windows, a boldly patterned panel featuring vertical stripes in cerulean and gray. Don't worry, she says before you can ask. We submitted Form 12C, subsection 3, weeks ago, approved by Internal Finishes. You nod and inspect the fabric. It's coarse, functional, nothing too extravagant, but she leans closer and adds, of course, we didn't tell them it's reversible. The other side is imperial blue. She winks. And there it is again. The quiet rebellion. The embroidery of resistance. A curtain is never just a curtain. It's a declaration. A statement. Sometimes even a trap. Historians still argue whether these bureaucratic décor wars reflected the fracturing of centralized authority or merely the emergence of petty fiefdoms inside the palace machine. One school suggests it was a warning sign of later decline. Another insists it was just the natural result of giving too many clever people not enough to do. Back in your department, Theocles is already drawing up a motion to review every window dressing installed in the last fiscal quarter. They think they can push the palette boundaries? He mutters. Well, we shall push back. He drafts a requisition for emergency swatch comparison sessions. You are to lead the first review. By evening, you're standing before an audience of 7 minor officials, all sipping diluted wine, as you hold up 2 nearly identical shades of beige. Left is oat, you explain, right is flax. A scribe in the back raises his hand. Which one matches the seasonal vestments of the Imperial Guard? You close your eyes for a moment, wondering what life would have been like as a baker or a fisherman, but when you open them, you're still here, surrounded by men in belted tunics arguing over whether eggshell is visually submissive. For your own sanity, you start keeping a color ledger. Not official, of course. Just a little notebook where you log the shades that cause the most disputes. Sun-drenched mustard. Forbidden in public records office. Peach. Triggers emotional instability among older staff. Olive. Mysterious religious overtones. One evening, while sipping tepid wine in the lantern glow of the supply room, a fellow junior officer whispers a secret. The Chamber of Official Script Copyists has started referring to your department as the Curtain Cult. They joke that you all pray to the god of gradient harmony. You laugh, but only a little, because part of you suspects they're not wrong. By now, you've started to dream in pigment. The color chart you once found mildly confusing is now etched into your mind like scripture. You can distinguish cinnabar from vermilion at 10 paces. But one color keeps rising like an imperial ghost through every complaint. Every accusation, every tightly worded memorandum. Purple. Not any purple. The purple. Tyrian. Sacred. So costly and so exclusive that the emperor himself wears it not just for fashion, but to embody divine authority. And tonight, as you drift through the candlelit archives with a fresh order to investigate unauthorized purple usage, you can almost smell it, that faintly fishy, oddly metallic scent that comes from boiling tens of thousands of murex snails into one thimbleful of dye. Here's your historical fact of the day. It took about 250,000 sea snails to make 1 ounce of Tyrian purple dye. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's documented, crusty snail reality. The process was so foul that workshops were kept far from residential areas. And the final product? A shimmering, almost bloody hue that caught the light like no other. You pause before a sealed scroll chest in the archive vault. It's wrapped in purple-tinted ribbon. Dangerously purple. You're not supposed to care. You're not a dye inspector. But your fingers itch. When you finally crack the chest open, what you find isn't scandalous drapery but purchase records, lists of names, amounts, and dye batches. Someone, it seems, has been using imperial-level purple on official seals, wax stamps, decorative trims, not just for the emperor, but for correspondence between the treasury and the Ministry of Ceremonial Salt Distribution. You rub your temples. Why salt? Why now? Because, apparently, the senior auditor for ceremonial salt thinks his office's contribution to public morale deserves a splash of prestige. Purple comforts the soul, he wrote in a now infamous note. And salt preserves it. It is only natural that we should share a visual identity. Historians still argue whether the color laws were strictly enforced across all classes or merely wielded as selective punishment for political rivals. There's enough evidence to support both views. Some clerks were fined for wearing plum-toned belts. Others, better connected, strutted about with violet-edged cloaks and suffered no consequences. You decide to follow the paper trail. The dye batch linked to the salt department turns out to have originated in Cyprus, passed through 2 guilds, and was triple approved by the Palace Department of Celebratory Events. How did it end up in the treasury? Someone's playing a dangerous game of cross-departmental patronage. The court's response? A symposium. Yes, they're calling a formal gathering to address the issue. Not to punish, of course, but to clarify expectations. You attend with a tablet and ink, expecting the usual drowsy speeches. Instead, you find yourself caught in the most impassioned room of civil servants since the Great Feather Quill debate of 901. One elderly scribe slams his hand on a mosaic inlaid table. You do not mix piety with pigmentation, he bellows. Another counters that the psychological effects of color are an overlooked administrative tool. A eunuch from the archive stands up and simply says, "If we all just wore gray, the empire would never have fallen." Then sits back down. You glance across the chamber and see a familiar face, Damaris. From the Bureau of Regional Maps. She flashes a sympathetic grimace. You both know this isn't about dye. It never was. It's about identity. Who matters? Who gets to shine? Even in curtain form. The meeting ends with a vague decree reaffirming imperial control over purple pigments. There are no fines, no sanctions, just a reminder, a subtle tightening of the leash. As you file out, one of the junior attendants passes by, adjusting his sash. It's plum-colored, but just faint enough to plausibly deny. He meets your gaze. No words exchange, but the message is clear. The war of shades will continue. Later that night, back in your chamber, you run your fingers across your own curtain. It's brown, modest, forgettable, and suddenly, you feel a strange pang. Not jealousy. Something deeper. A desire to matter, even if only by the thread count of your drapery. Morning returns with the metallic clink of water jugs and the soft shuffle of sandals in the hallway. You roll off your straw-stuffed cot and blink into the dim gray of a cloudy Constantinople dawn. Another day. Another chance to enforce imperial taste standards. You dress carefully. Neutral tunic. Regulation belt. No embroidery. You don't want to risk accidental symbolism before your first tea. Today's task? Investigate robe infractions. You arrive at the Hall of Correspondence just in time to see a young clerk being scolded by an older superior. His crime? Wearing a sash one shade too red. Not crimson, mind you. That's for high officials on feast days, but something called sunset berry. The older man gestures furiously at the sash, shouting, "Are you trying to impersonate the imperial wine steward?" This might sound absurd, but here's your mainstream historical fact. Byzantium had strict sumptuary laws, regulations about who could wear what, when, and why. Color, fabric, even the angle of a hemline could mark your rank. It wasn't just fashion, it was code, a visual spreadsheet that told everyone where you stood. You flip open your ledger and start noting the violation. The clerk's sash was dyed locally, possibly with unauthorized berry extracts. You're required to confiscate it and issue a formal warning. As you do, he pleads, "It was my grandmother's. She sewed it when I got promoted." You hesitate, but rules are rules. A small part of you wonders how many lives have been quietly redirected by fabric choices. You've begun to notice the robe police everywhere now. Not officially called that, of course, but practically every hallway has someone squinting at tunics, measuring sleeve width with their eyes. You pass one inspector running his fingers along a cuff, muttering something about excessive luster. Another is arguing whether bronze thread should count as metallic or ornamental. In the afternoon, you attend a color calibration meeting. The goal? Standardize the terms used in fabric descriptions. What one office calls storm cloud, another calls light ash. You sit through arguments over whether fern green should include yellowish undertones, or whether it represents the imperial forest lands. The minutes from this session will be 42 pages long, most of it filled with poetic descriptions of beige. Here's a quirky tidbit. There was once an actual department that inspected clothing worn by visitors to the court. These inspectors would veto outfits that clashed with state ceremonies. If your hat didn't match the imperial calendar's seasonal palette, you were turned away at the door. No exceptions. After the meeting, you find yourself wandering to the drapery archive. It's a long, shadowy room lined with shelves of folded cloth, each labeled with the date, department, and approved thematic alignment. You run your hand over a bolt of fabric marked ceremonial gray. Length 899. A moth flutters out and vanishes into the gloom. You spot something unusual. A new submission scroll tucked into the shelf beside a sample of copper-colored brocade. It's from the Guild of Government Seamstresses, requesting clearance for experimental layering effects in ceremonial robes. You sigh. The layering debate again. Someone's trying to sneak in visual complexity under the guise of texture. Historians still argue whether these visual enforcement rituals were genuine efforts to maintain order or merely elaborate power games. Some say the color codes helped glue the empire together. Others believe they were distractions from deeper cracks, religious tensions, military decay, economic pressure. You head back through the scriptorium wing, where junior monks are copying government decrees. One of them has added a tiny doodle in the margin, a robe with wings and the caption, "Beware the fashion demons." You almost laugh, but catch yourself. Humor is rarely welcome in your job, especially when it involves embroidery. That evening, while reviewing the day's notes, you stumble on a small memo from an anonymous source. It's unsigned, but the handwriting is crisp. Curtain in South Library contains unauthorized silver thread. Matches rumored pattern of northern faction. You exhale slowly. Politics are now entering your drapery domain. That silver thread isn't decorative. It's a message. You stash the note in your inner pocket, glance out your tiny window, and see the city lights shimmering off the Bosphorus. Purple may be the symbol of empire, but tonight, it's the glint of silver that keeps your mind turning. The next morning brings the kind of weather that makes the city feel like a steamed vegetable, humid, cloying, and full of muttering pedestrians trying not to sweat through their tunics. You arrive early at the state tailor's compound, expecting a routine inspection. Instead, you walk directly into a standoff. 10 tailors, all in state-issued aprons, are gathered in a tight circle. Their voices are sharp, their gestures theatrical. One slams a bolt of yellow velvet onto a table. Another waves a spindle of silver thread like it's a sword. You are handed a copy of their formal grievance, sealed with the guild emblem, an urgent petition regarding unfair drapery oversight practices. You clear your throat. I was told this was a review of window valance usage. A voice shoots back. We are the ones who stitch the valances. And no one consulted us about that horrific mauve trim in the Hall of Naval Accounts. Here's your historical fact. Byzantine guilds weren't just professional collectives. They were semi-political bodies with real weight. Tailors, dyers, mosaic workers, goldsmiths, scribes, all organized, regulated, and ready to protest if their interests were overlooked. The state depended on them, but it also feared them. You scan the petition. Their demands are oddly poetic. More input on palette selection, fairer distribution of decorative commissions, and most emphatically, veto power over clashing seasonal textiles. You flip to the final page, where someone has scrawled in large letters, "We are not decorative afterthoughts." You try to calm them down, reminding them that decorative hierarchy is delicate, woven with centuries of ceremonial rules. One of the tailors, an elderly man with eyes like a hawk and fingers stained blue, leans in. Curtains shape mood. Mood shapes obedience. If we're forced to make joyless drapes, the empire becomes joyless too. That night, you find yourself thinking about his words more than you'd care to admit. Historians still argue whether guild protests like this one had any long-term influence on policy or were just tolerated noise. Some scholars believe the tailors' complaints helped relax some of the stricter dye usage rules in the 11th century. Others argue that no policy ever changed without imperial tantrums. The next day, your office receives a formal invitation to a fabric harmony dialogue session. This is code for we are going to pretend to listen to each other while guarding our egos like sacred relics. The meeting room is already too warm when you arrive. A jug of watery wine sits untouched on the side table. Representatives from the Tailors Guild, the Decorative Oversight Board, and the Ministry of Ceremonial Ambience are all present. You recognize Damaris in the back row, subtly sketching something in her ledger. Possibly a fire escape. The dialogue begins with polite nods. It ends 2 hours later with one official storming out after being accused of design terrorism. The guild refuses to back down. They demand creative input. The state side responds by threatening a review of their dye license. You, meanwhile, are asked to take notes. Your fingers ache from trying to keep up with the vocabulary gymnastics. Austere but inviting. Regal melancholy. Imperially sympathetic thread tension. After the meeting, one young tailor catches up to you in the corridor. He pulls from his satchel a folded piece of silk. Forest flame, he says, unfolding it. The color is breathtaking. A reddish green that seems to glow and cool all at once. Too bold, he shrugs. It'll never be approved. You stare at the fabric, suddenly unsure whether you're part of the solution or just another bureaucratic speed bump. Later, as you walk home under a fading sky, you see someone hanging laundry across a side street. Tunics, sashes, a few sheets, all beige, brown, and gray. Safe colors, sanctioned colors, but somehow, they've never looked so dull. You glance at your own sleeve. Dull flax, as always. Regulation fabric, regulation mood, but inside your coat pocket, that sliver of forbidden silk still glows faintly like a smuggled ember. You don't report it, not yet. You arrive early to the records office the next day, bleary-eyed and already sweating. The humidity hasn't broken, and the air smells faintly of ink, beeswax, and someone's disappointing breakfast. You had hoped for a quiet shift, maybe an inventory of scroll labels or a light scrollworm prevention patrol. But your hopes are dashed before your sandals even hit the mosaic floor. There's a new memo pinned to the central board, written in the ornate looping script of someone trying to look more important than they are. Subject: Color Protocol Review for State Messaging Chambers. The real issue lies deeper in the text, where it notes that crimson drapes were hung yesterday in the Chamber of Tax Oversight. Despite the prior decision to use russet, the memo hints darkly, may be interpreted as a targeted visual rebuke of adjacent ministries. And there it is. Curtains as communication. You make your way to the Chamber of Tax Oversight, where a middle-aged official named Petros greets you with a tight smile. Admiring the crimson? He asks, gesturing toward the newly installed drapes. They billow slightly in the draft, casting red flickers on the mosaic of a weary St. Matthew. They weren't approved, you say carefully, pulling out your scroll of regulations. Russet was agreed upon by interdepartmental consensus. Russet implies humility. Petros waves you off. Russet is for provincial grain ledgers. This is the revenue backbone of the empire. Crimson speaks with appropriate authority. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Byzantine political culture, symbolism was a battlefield. Mosaic placement, curtain color, seating arrangements, they all carried political weight. A well-placed tapestry could signify imperial favor. A mismatched color scheme might suggest opposition. These weren't just design choices. They were low-stakes coups. You make notes. The fabric is dyed properly. The seams follow protocol. But the choice of color was unauthorized. Your hand hovers over the violation line, unsure whether this is worth escalating. Petros leans in, lowering his voice. You know what this is really about. Those fools across the hall in the Ministry of Shipping. They've been flaunting their new sapphire wall hangings for months. We needed to reassert. You glance through the chamber doorway and see exactly what he means. Across the corridor, the Ministry of Shipping has opted for oceanic grandeur. Rich blue silk with golden anchor motifs. The fact that this was technically approved by the subcommittee on thematic drapery alignment only fuels the bitterness. Back in your office, Theocles listens to your report and nods gravely. This is escalating, he mutters. Curtains as coded insults. I knew it would happen eventually. He pulls out a scroll titled Textile Diplomacy Framework. Draft V, as if this has been his plan all along. That afternoon, you're summoned to an impromptu review panel. 3 departments, 5 color schemes, and one increasingly bewildered judge from the Bureau of Symbolic Affairs. Damaris is there again, arms crossed, watching the spectacle unfold. One clerk insists that olive green valances signal stability. Another accuses him of aesthetic bullying. A junior inspector nearly faints when someone suggests pairing amber with charcoal. Charcoal is funeral fabric, she gasps. Historians still argue whether these decorative choices truly influenced policy or merely reflected underlying power plays. One interpretation suggests that color symbolism was so ingrained it became unconscious, an empire expressing its inner rot through the slow fade of its curtains. You scribble notes, trying not to roll your eyes too visibly. The highlight of the session comes when a ledger keeper from the Provincial Decrees Office delivers a passionate soliloquy on why periwinkle causes emotional dissonance in fiscal environments. The room applauds. After the meeting, you linger in the hallway with Damaris. She hands you a folded scrap of parchment. Saw this posted in the rear corridor. She says, it's a copy of a circular issued by the Tailors Guild, calling for a color moratorium, a 1-month freeze on any new palette decisions. You raise an eyebrow. A color truce? Apparently someone's valance selection caused a scribe to resign. She shrugs. The guild wants calm. For once. You both chuckle softly, then fall silent. The hallway is lined with gold-trimmed cornices and dull beige drapery. Uncontroversial. Forgettable. But for now, safe. You wonder what it would take to actually simplify things. Ban all color. Drape the whole palace in white linen. Like a sick room. Let formality speak instead of pigment. But even that, you suspect, would spark its own rebellion. Someone would say the white felt too West Syrian. Someone else would insist it wasn't white enough. You go home that night exhausted, with thread debates echoing in your mind. But somewhere beneath it all, a deeper question itches. If every fabric is a political message, then who gets to speak? You arrive at the palace the next morning to an unusual buzz. Not the standard grumblings about quill shortages or over-salted lentils in the commissary. No, this is sharper, more electric, a rumor, passed between departments with theatrical whispers. The curtains in the Empress's east-facing window have been replaced. You almost drop your inkwell. You don't work in the Empress's wing. You're several layers of importance below that, orbiting somewhere between municipal candle approvals and linen fold documentation. But everyone knows that any change in the empress's decor, especially the east-facing decor, is recorded, archived, and choreographed years in advance. For them to be replaced overnight means someone bypassed protocol or defied it. You trot to the corridor near the Hall of Icons, where you can just barely peek into the restricted zone. And there they are. The rumors were true. The old dusty green curtains, symbolic of continuity, humility, and the Basil lineage, are gone. In their place, navy. Not dark blue, not temple blue, navy. A color associated with military campaigns, naval dominance, and, according to a very controversial scroll from 40 years ago, strategic aggression. You take out your wax tablet and start a draft memo. You're not even halfway through before someone else beats you to it. By mid-morning, the scribes of at least 5 departments have submitted incident reports, and 2 minor secretaries from the Treasury are already in tears over perceived implications. Here's your historical fact. In the year 912 AD, a relatively minor alteration in the ceremonial drapery scheme did, in fact, lead to a week-long bureaucratic stalemate. The change was interpreted by one faction as a deliberate snub of long-standing alliances. Another saw it as a coup rehearsal. It wasn't. The seamstress simply made a mistake. But no one believed that. And the aftermath included 3 forced retirements and a 30-page investigation into thread dye sourcing. Today, you're living through what might be a similar situation. Damaris finds you near the reflecting pool. Expression unreadable. You heard? She asks. Though it's not a question. You nod. They say the Empress's chamberlain requested the change after a dream. Dreams. She scoffs. Next we'll be hanging drapes based on lunar moods. You both know it's not about dreams. It's about signaling. The Empress rarely attends council meetings. She rarely needs to. Her curtains speak in her stead. That afternoon, the Department of Iconographic Consistency calls an emergency session. You sit among familiar faces. The same ones who argued last week about whether bronze thread was too optimistic for harvest season. Now, the stakes are higher. Theories fly across the table. The Navy is a reference to the Anatolian fleet. She's aligning with the Admiralty. She's warning the court. Navy curtains were hung the night before Emperor Basil's deposition. She's mourning something. Navy is also associated with grief in the southern provinces. You don't even bother raising your hand. You're too busy watching a small fly circle a glass of diluted wine on the table. Somehow, the fly is the only being in the room not overwhelmed by shade politics. Historians still argue whether the window affair of 912 AD genuinely shifted imperial power balances or merely exposed the fragility of the court's mental health. One perspective treats it as evidence of how symbolism became a substitute for real political engagement. Another suggests it was irrational, coded language in a society where speech was often dangerous. Either way, you're now on the official Curtain Emergency Response Committee. You didn't ask to be here. Your name was volunteered by Theocles, who now claims he's too emotionally compromised by the Navy to participate. Your assignment is to investigate procurement, who ordered the fabric, how it was delivered, and most importantly, whether the choice of Navy was an accident or an act of veiled hostility. By twilight, you found the order, signed not by the chamberlain, but by his assistant, a young woman whose name barely registers in the palace directory. A scapegoat, most likely, or a fool, or both. You return to your chamber, exhausted, clutching a fabric sample. It's beautiful, honestly, rich and heavy, with just a hint of iridescence. You hang it on your wall beside your regular curtain, just for a moment, just to see how it catches the light. And somehow, your room feels different, sharper, braver, as though it, too, might finally be noticed. Your day begins not with tea, but with a eunuch asking if teal is a seditious color. He is dressed impeccably, with gold-trimmed sandals and a tunic that fits him too well to be regulation issue. He stands in your office doorway holding a swatch of fabric like it's a dead pigeon. Be honest, he says. Does this read as decay to you? You blink twice. Excuse me? The teal. We're thinking of reupholstering the hallway benches in the northeast colonnade. But one of the senior archivists says it feels funereal. And another says it resembles mold. I need an unbiased ruling. You take the fabric, hold it to the light, and suppress a sigh. This is your life now, judge, jury, and color therapist. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Eunuchs held enormous administrative power in Byzantium, often rising to high ranks in palace affairs and religious appointments. They were frequently entrusted with court management, diplomacy, and even military logistics. And yes, in some cases, they oversaw aspects of court presentation, including interior aesthetics. You accompany him to the colonnade, where 4 other eunuchs await your verdict. They are seated on mismatched cushions, each holding a swatch of different blues. The air is thick with polite disagreement. You quickly learn this isn't just a furniture choice. This is an internal power struggle between 2 factions within the archival wing, one pushing for cool tranquility, the other for subdued reverence. As you examine the options, an older eunuch with a voice like crumpled parchment speaks up. Teal, he says, suggests corruption. It's the color of tarnished copper. Bad omens. And fish. Another interrupts. That's superstition. Teal reflects modernity. It evokes the Bosphorus. A third raises a trembling finger. Teal is what they hung in the council chamber before the patriarchate scandal. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether these palace factions were driven by ideology or personal vendettas masked as aesthetic preferences. Some believe eunuchs used color schemes as strategic tools in bureaucratic chess. Others claim the drapery debates were just formalized pettiness. You listen patiently, then point out that lighting conditions will make the teal appear grayer indoors. You also gently suggest that the benches in question are mostly covered by visiting officials' robes and therefore barely visible. This earns a contemplative silence, followed by slow nods. For a moment, peace seems possible, but then someone suggests a pattern. Pattern. The word alone resets the whole room. Now they're arguing about stripes versus damask, horizontal versus vertical weave logic, and whether repeated motifs dilute imperial symbolism. You pretend to take notes while mentally floating several miles above the building. Later, back in your department, Theocles is beaming. Excellent news, he announces. The Empress has requested an evaluation of curtain symbolism in relation to seasonal mood balance. We've been summoned to present findings. You feel your soul briefly leave your body. Your team gathers scrolls, diagrams, swatches, and quotes from apocryphal decorative treatises. One junior clerk includes a hand-drawn wheel of emotionally resonant hues, featuring expressions like bashful loyalty and provincial melancholy. No one dares critique it. You're sent ahead to review the chamber. The Empress's private sitting room is cavernous and cool, filled with filtered light from tall arched windows. The curtains are a soft ivory with gold pinstripe borders. Safe, neutral, unoffensive. You count 15 pleats per panel, well within the acceptable drapery fold index. And yet, her mood will turn the room. You've only seen her twice. Always at a distance, her face calm and unreadable. She speaks rarely but makes choices that ripple across the empire. And now, she is apparently contemplating a complete palette shift. Damaris appears at your side with a sample packet. She's considering sage green. She whispers, "Thoughts?" You shrug. Sage is peaceful. Maybe too peaceful. Might read as apathy. She's worried teal is cursed. Damaris replies. You look around at the polished furniture. The marble floor that smells faintly of incense and orange peel. The silence so thick you could float on it. A cursed teal. You think. That's the Byzantines in a phrase. Spiritual unease wrapped in silk. Before leaving, you tuck a note under the cushion nearest the window. An anonymous suggestion to combine ivory with muted olive. Safe, but interesting. Regal, but not loud. A compromise. You walk out of the palace into the late-day sun, unsure whether you've helped soothe imperial minds or just added another layer to the great Byzantine blanket of confusion. But hey, at least no one mentioned magenta today. You're halfway through breakfast, stale bread dipped in something pretending to be wine, when the summons arrives. A runner from the inner treasury, red in the face and short on breath, hands you a sealed scroll marked confidential, budget review. Category 47F, decorative expenditures, drapery only. You groan. Category 47F is not your favorite. It means hours in the archive of subdivided expenses. Squinting at columns of ink tracking things like twine consumption per panel and seasonal silk humidity damage mitigation. But this scroll has a red ribbon. Red means someone is angry. Possibly the emperor. You report to the designated chamber where two clerks from the Imperial Revenue Bureau await. Their faces are stone, their posture worse. They point you toward a scroll that unfurls all the way to the floor. You glance at the heading. Fiscal Summary of Curtain Dye Procurement, last 6 years. You start reading. The numbers are staggering. Here's your historical fact. Palace decor in Byzantium could cost more than some provincial military garrisons. Especially when Tyrian purple or gold thread embroidery was involved. One record from Constantine VII's court shows more funds allocated to re-dyeing ceremonial banners than to an entire month of palace guard pay. Line after line confirms it. 8,000 solidi spent on imported dye from Tyre. More on decorative tassels from Antioch. Still more on emergency shipment of Venetian silk when domestic suppliers ran out. You find an entry labeled Empress's Hallway Shade Adjustment. Late spring lighting discrepancy. Cost. Absurd. You sit back. Does anyone even check these totals? One clerk shrugs. We try. But decorative affairs files expense reports in allegorical verse now. Last month's summary rhymed lavender with ambassador. You flip to the hidden section. Scrolls within scrolls. Coded not for secrecy but sheer inconvenience. Here, you find the kicker. Several entries labeled urgent replacement were used not due to wear or sunlight but because the symbolic tone no longer fit the prevailing political mood. Translation. Someone got offended by a shade and spent public money to fix it. You press your fingers to your forehead. This isn't just excess. It's fiscal theater. And yet, no one is surprised. Later, you bring your findings to Theocles. Expecting outrage. He chuckles. Of course they overspent. He says, sipping licorice root tea. Drapery is diplomacy. Would you rather insult a visiting emir with sun-faded brocade? You mutter, I'd rather pay the garrison. He waves this off. The garrison doesn't sit beneath valances. The emir does. You jot down a note. Create subcategory for visible insult risk. You're joking. Mostly. That evening, Damaris meets you near the stables. She's holding 2 scrolls. One is a color request for a new map room. The other? A secret budget file. They spent more on curtain trim in the Imperial soapworks than on entire bridge maintenance last year. She says, clean curtains matter more than safe roads. You reply without blinking. Historians still argue whether these expenditures were signs of late imperial rot or simply an empire with its aesthetic priorities misaligned. One camp insists that ceremonial splendor kept up morale. Another believes it masked structural decay. Like gilding on a termite-ridden doorframe. You and Damaris sit on the edge of a dry fountain and pass the scrolls back and forth. Eventually, she hands you a small wax-sealed envelope. From a friend, she says, Guild of Dyers, internal memo. You break the seal. Inside is a crude tally chart. Scrawled in haste. Monthly dye purchases, department breakdown. Treasury, 16 bolts. Ceremonial offices, 22 bolts. Tailors Guild, approved, 9 bolts. Unknown, unrecorded, 31 bolts. 31 unaccounted? You whisper. She nods. Someone stockpiling. Who? She shrugs. That's your job now. You tuck the envelope away and watch as the sun dips behind the Hagia Sophia. The city is quiet, but somewhere in its folds and corners, someone is hoarding dye like it's gold. And with it, influence. You stand. Let's find them. Damaris smirks. Tomorrow. Tonight. I'm dyeing socks. They've only ever let me use approved beige. I'm thinking crimson. You grin and walk back toward your chamber. Beige socks. Crimson rebellion. Byzantium in a single step. The day begins with a chapel visit. Which sounds peaceful until you see the scaffolding. You're not here to pray. You've been summoned to review a newly restored mosaic, more precisely. The background of the mosaic. A group of monks, enthusiastic but color confused, has painted the halo backdrop behind St. Demetrius a bright lemon yellow. The problem? The original scheme, according to protocol records, was muted saffron. You try not to sigh. Again, the head monk, a wiry man with ink on his fingers and a nervous smile, greets you with the kind of reverence usually reserved for relics. We followed the spirit of the text, he says, gesturing toward the book of iconographic consistency, which is propped open to a heavily annotated page. You climb the scaffolding for a better look. The lemon is vivid, jarring against the saint's tunic, which is itself a too bright shade of coral. The whole effect is less divine awe. More imperial fruit stand. You open your ledger. Did you submit a pre-approval request for palate deviation? The monk scratches his neck. We thought this would lift the spirit. Here's your historical fact. Byzantine iconography was subject to strict artistic rules. So much so that entire councils were convened to address whether the placement of color in a religious image could convey heresy. Yes, heresy. A green background might suggest incorrect theology. A blue sky where none belongs could imply doctrinal error. You step down from the scaffolding and find a small gathering of lower monks already arguing over whether the new colors convey resurrective energy or seasonal confusion. One of them waves a pigment chart as if it were a gospel. Outside the chapel, the mood is no less chaotic. A group from the Decorative Oversight Board has arrived. They want to compare the monks' work against the master palette of sacred chromatics. Damaris shows up halfway through the debate with a mug of something warm and murky. You're glowing, she says, nodding toward the paint flecks on your cheek. Lemon yellow heresy, you mutter. She snorts. An hour later, the chapel bell rings, and the debate moves to whether repainting constitutes sacrilege or restoration. Someone from the Treasury insists that repainting again will exceed budgetary permissions under Category 42E, religious touch-up funds. You scan the ceiling, noting how the bright yellow reflects poorly off the gold leaf. It's garish, it's wrong, but it is eye-catching. You suggest a compromise. Tone down the yellow using a thin saffron glaze. It preserves the new layer, acknowledges the error, and avoids calling the monks heretics in front of the congregation. The board agrees. The monks bow. You leave, exhausted but mildly victorious. Historians still argue whether these tiny aesthetic decisions reflect genuine religious devotion or bureaucratic paranoia dressed as piety. One faction of scholars insists color was used to guide the faithful. Another believes the faithful were merely an excuse for the empire's internal aesthetic battles. That afternoon, back in your office, you receive a scroll labeled Iconographic Incident, Secondary Complication. Apparently, a different chapel has begun repainting a mural in solidarity with the monks you just reprimanded. Their new background? Periwinkle. You drop your head onto your desk. Periwinkle is not even on the approved ecclesiastical spectrum. It falls somewhere between the martyrdom mauve crisis of 843 and the notorious peacock ceiling of 879. Both of which nearly caused schisms. Theoclides passes by, humming an ancient hymn and oblivious to your spiraling thoughts. Good day to you, he chirps, holding a bolt of tan cloth. I'm meeting with the Garment Revision Committee. We're debating sleeve length across administrative departments. You stare at him. What's wrong with sleeves? Symbolism, he replies. Sleeves that droop too long imply mourning. Sleeves too short suggest hubris. You nod slowly. Of course they do. That evening, you walk home through the lantern-lit streets of Constantinople. The sky is a deep indigo. Soft and serious. You pass a bakery, a tavern, two dogs fighting over a fishbone. And then, rounding a corner, you see something unexpected. A faded wall painting. An old saint, long since washed out by wind and sun. But in the halo behind him, a ghost of color remains. Not gold, not saffron, something between the two. A quiet yellow, a human yellow. No one argued about this one. It was forgotten, and yet, it remains. You pause, reach out, and rest your fingers on the peeling stone. Maybe the empire's not held together by gold or dye or layered sashes. Maybe it's held together by those who still care what the walls look like. You're barely through the threshold of your office the next morning when a scroll smacks you in the chest. It's from the Office of Imperial Decrees. Sealed in wax bearing the unmistakable emblem of the emperor himself. You break it open, careful not to tear the ornate border. You read the words twice, then once more aloud in disbelief. By order of His Imperial Majesty, the usage of purple in all decorative and administrative applications, save those directly associated with the emperor's own person, is to be suspended indefinitely. You sit down, hard. Theoclides is pacing already. A full ban? He sputters, his hands flapping like flags in a sea wind. That's not decorum. That's anarchy with upholstery. The implications settle around you like dust. No more purple curtain trims. No purple wax seals. No purple backing for imperial documents. Banners, vestments, or As the decree chillingly adds, floral emulations or tablecloths within ceremonial spaces. The empire has just amputated its most sacred color. Here's your historical fact. Emperor Leo VI once outlawed the wearing of purple garments by anyone not of imperial blood. Even officials with lifetime service records were required to surrender ceremonial robes if they bore the banned hue. It wasn't just exclusivity, it was existential branding. The empire was purple. Damaris appears in your doorway. Scroll in hand, eyebrows raised so high they could pierce the clouds. Have you seen it? You just gesture at the desk. We're in a beige empire now. By mid-morning, panic spreads. Officials storm the drapery depository in search of compliant replacements. Couriers run through halls whispering about hidden reserves of lavender bunting that must now be destroyed. A junior clerk tries to repaint his purple sandals black using soot and vinegar. It does not go well. You're summoned to a debriefing in the South Wing, where a new subcommittee has formed, the Commission for Post-Purple Transition. The walls are still adorned with plum-trimmed brocade, but you notice they've been half pulled down, as though ashamed of themselves. The mood is grim. One official suggests an empire-wide curtain bleaching effort. Another proposes dyeing everything saffron as a show of collective repentance. A third, looking haunted, whispers, "We can't use mauve, that's too close." Someone else suggests embracing beige. A neutral empire. A quiet empire. Historians still argue whether this so-called beige rebellion of the late 10th century was real policy or a desperate cosmetic stunt. One interpretation sees it as a symbolic reset, an effort to purify imperial aesthetics after too many visual scandals. Another sees it as a sign of deep rot, a regime obsessed with cloth while the borderlands burned. You return to your office and find your team mid-panic. Theocles is wrapping purple tassels in burlap. A junior clerk is crying quietly into a lavender-trimmed scroll case. You take a deep breath, roll up your sleeves, and begin composing an index, transitional palettes for emergency implementation. That evening, you venture to the Tailors Guild to deliver the new directives. They greet the news with a mix of fury and quiet vindication. The same elder tailor who once lectured you about color as mood simply mutters. He couldn't bear the competition. You know exactly who he means. And yet, even among this chaos, the black market whispers begin. Damaris tells you she's heard rumors of hoarded violet bolts in the basement of the Decorative Hymnal Review Committee. Another clerk insists someone's hiding an unopened crate of Tyrian dye beneath the chapel of St. Methodios. You walk through the palace that night under torchlight. The new curtain colors are already going up, faded green, dusty ochre, humble tan. They are quiet, muted, forgettable. But you notice something curious. In one corner of the records chamber, a banner hangs slightly crooked. The edge of its fabric has been carefully folded and stitched shut. You reach up, gently tug the seam, and there it is. The underside, still purple, hidden, not gone. You smile, because you know this empire. It may bend, it may rebrand, but it never forgets its favorite color. By now, the corridors feel strange without purple. You pass the same archways, the same busts of long-forgotten strategoi, the same creaking benches, but something is missing. The spaces feel blander, washed, like someone drained the blood from the palace, leaving behind linen ghosts. But the silence doesn't last. 3 nights after the imperial ban, a rumor slips from the kitchens and spreads like spilled dye. Someone swapped a bolt of beige curtain fabric with one secretly laced with violet undertones. Not the kind you can see in torchlight. No, these show themselves only at dawn, when the eastern sun hits just right. And then, the walls glow. You don't believe it, not until you see it. It's early, and you're in the eastern wing checking moisture levels on a batch of new drapery samples. You step into a minor council chamber and freeze. The light streams through a slit window. And there it is, a soft, unmistakable shimmer of forbidden violet brushing the edges of the beige fabric like a ghost's perfume. It's subtle, so subtle that no one would notice unless they were looking for it. You are now looking for it everywhere. Here's your quirky tidbit. Byzantines were masters of hidden detail. Codices with invisible annotations, mosaics only viewable in certain candlelight. And yes, fabrics dyed in layers. So one color blooms over another depending on light and weather. An entire theology once debated whether hidden icon layers violated spiritual transparency. It was, as you might guess, a very heated discussion. Later that day, you visit the central dies registry and find that 5 bolts marked "Acru" were mysteriously altered in transit. Someone's changed the merchant seals. The records say one thing, but the cloth says another. Historians still argue whether this period saw a rise in symbolic rebellion through textiles or if it's just modern projection onto what was likely a case of poor inventory management. But based on what you're seeing now, there's no way this is an accident. Damaris confirms it that evening over lukewarm stew in the break room. "Guild of Dyers," she whispers. "They've gone rogue." You blink. Rogue? She nods. "They're still producing purple. Off the books. Smuggled in under other labels. Evening ash, deep lilac, morning plum. It's everywhere." You stare at your spoon. The whole empire is pretending it's beige while secretly bathing itself in violet light. "Why risk it?" you ask. She grins. "Because it still means something. And because it's fun." That night, you find a scroll slipped under your door. No signature. Just a small, folded note. "South wing. 3rd window. After sundown." You go. Of course you go. And there, under a half-closed shutter, you find it. A single curtain. Hastily stitched. Dyed deep navy over a buried purple layer. As the light fades, the navy recedes, and the purple hums underneath like an ancient melody. It's not bold, but it's defiant. Someone did this on purpose. You run your fingers along the hem and feel a tiny patch of embroidered initials. Too small to read in the dark. But there. This is no longer about aesthetic preference or protocol. This is about survival. Visual whispers in a regime trying to silence its own identity. The next morning, the curtain is gone. In its place, beige. Official. Flat. Unremarkable. But someone has left a single strand of purple thread caught in the window latch. A message. Clear as the sunrise. The palace is buzzing with preparation. A diplomatic envoy from the caliphate is arriving tomorrow. And every corridor smells of polish, citrus oil, and panic. You're assigned to the Decorations Review Committee. A 10-person battalion tasked with ensuring every tassel, drape, and embroidered napkin projects exactly the right mixture of opulence and humility. You're halfway through evaluating the curtains in the East Reception Hall when a scribe bursts in. Face pale. "They've hung mauve," he hisses. You blink. "Where?" "The grand vestibule. Just now. And the ambassador's chamber. Mauve." You feel something shift in your gut. Not fear. Not yet, but the kind of tension that precedes a disaster so dumb it'll be carved into memory like a cracked relief above a temple doorway. You rush to the vestibule, dodging servants and sidestepping couriers. And then stop dead. It's true. There, framing the entrance like a soft sneer, are freshly hung mauve curtains. Pale, lavender tinge. Neither bold nor bashful, mauve. A color no one quite agrees on. And therefore, the most dangerous color of all. Here's your historical fact. Byzantine diplomacy was as much theater as policy. Every element of a visiting envoy's experience, meals, seating order, architecture, color palette, was calculated for political effect. There are records of envoys storming out over being served on gold-rimmed plates instead of solid gold. And yes, there are letters referencing fabric colors interpreted as insults or provocations. You step into the chamber. A group of decorators is already mid-argument. One insists mauve is neutral, calming, non-threatening. Another counters that it suggests compromise, a color for cowards. A third says it's associated with plague mourning in parts of Mesopotamia. Someone shouts, "It's off lavender." No one's offended by off lavender. You call for silence. The ambassador is arriving at dawn. If he walks in and interprets this as weakness, or sarcasm, or sympathy with a rival faction, he might walk out. Damaris finishes, appearing beside you with a clipboard and that familiar spark of dread disguised as fascination in her eyes. You pull the curtain aside and inspect the tag, Tailor's Guild. Delivery 3 days ago. Dye batch D17. Approved for domestic ceremonial chambers only. So why's it here? You ask. No one answers. You request an immediate replacement, only to learn that the only approved alternatives, cream and cinnamon, are currently tied up in a hanging schedule dispute in the treasury. Of course they are. Historians still argue whether this specific diplomatic incident ever escalated. One school believes the ambassador never noticed. Another insists that the mauve incident sparked a quiet freeze in trade agreements that lasted 3 years. A third points out that the ambassador's chronic eye strain may have rendered him completely colorblind. Which makes the entire crisis impressively pointless. You don't have time for theories. You have a hallway full of mauve. You try stalling tactics. Candles are dimmed. Curtains are looped so only the inner lining shows. An emergency order is placed for neutral gray hangings. But the delivery camel breaks a sandal strap outside the hippodrome, and the driver refuses to enter palace grounds without his full footwear ensemble. Eventually, someone suggests draping the mauve panels in gauze. It softens the tone, blurs the offensive tint. You sigh and allow it. Then the ambassador arrives. He's stoic, unreadable, flanked by aides in flowing black and ivory. As he enters the vestibule, his gaze brushes the drapes. You hold your breath. He pauses, looks at the gauze, then at you, and then smiles. Later, you learn his palace has mauve accents throughout. His daughter's name even translates roughly to evening blossom, a term sometimes used in local dialects for that very shade. Crisis averted. For now. But that evening, Damaris finds you by the fountain. Eyes narrowed. You know this wasn't an accident. What wasn't? The Tailors Guild. Someone wanted that color in that room. To embarrass the palace? To test us. She hands you a strip of fabric. Not mauve. Not even close. It's a deep, vivid violet. Folded, hidden, pressed between lining layers of the ambassador's curtain. Invisible unless peeled back. You trace your fingers along the seam. It's happening again. You barely sleep that night. Not from fear. Exactly. But from anticipation. Whoever planted the hidden violet strip inside the ambassador's curtain isn't just a prankster. They're making a statement. A quiet rebellion stitched beneath official approval. And if they slipped one message under the court's nose, how many others are hanging in plain sight? By morning, you're pacing outside the Bureau of Fabric Oversight with a fresh cup of tea and a stolen sense of purpose. You're not just a curtain auditor anymore. You're a hunter now, a seeker of rogue thread. Inside the Bureau's vaulted main room, bolts of fabric lie stacked like loaves in a divine bakery. You begin the inspection politely, sample by sample, linen by linen. You unfold an ivory panel meant for the treasury antechamber and, there it is. Again, a barely visible stitch, right along the hem, violet thread, cleverly inverted so that only the tiniest sliver peeks from the underside. So subtle that a distracted seamstress would miss it. But someone wanted it found. You submit a quiet report. Not public, not formal, just a personal note logged in a sealed envelope and slipped under Damaris's door. 2 words. Second instance. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 10th century, the Byzantine bureaucracy was so layered, so intricate, that enforcement of imperial edicts often depended more on personal interpretation than on compliance. Laws were written, decreed, copied, circulated, then often contextualized by mid-level officials. It was law as opera, dramatic, stylized, and not necessarily binding. Back in the corridor, you spot a junior scribe rushing down the hall with an armful of drapery samples. You stop him, ask to inspect one, officially, of course, and quickly discover another anomaly. A bolt of tundra tan that smells faintly of the alchemical vinegar wash used to fix purple dye. You don't even need to look. You already know. That evening, you and Damaris convene in the seldom used inventory room behind the secondary archive stacks. You lay your findings on the stone table, 4 curtain bolts. All with hidden threads, mismatched linings, or dye traces too faint to be coincidence. She brings out a scroll of production ledgers, lists of approved suppliers. All meticulously forged. It's not just fabric, she says. It's distribution. There's a route. Someone's moving restricted dyes through municipal storage facilities. Why risk it? You ask again. Her eyes narrow. Because the empire's color is being erased. And not everyone's willing to surrender purple just because a nervous emperor said so. You run your hand along a sample panel. It's a muted gold, approved for the empress's seasonal reception wing. But behind the edge binding is a tag. Initials sewn in tiny violet thread. Someone's counting. You whisper. Someone's watching. She answers. Historians still argue whether the underground resistance to the Purple Ban was ever formally organized. Some records suggest a loose guild coalition. Others point to independent actors, tailors, clerks, couriers, each driven by nostalgia, mischief, or defiance. But here, now, you know it's more than rebellion. It's an archive, a shadow inventory of loyalty stitched into the margins of legality. Over the next few days, you begin collecting discrete samples, always careful, always quiet. You label them by chamber, date, suspected source. A tapestry in the Hall of Scrolls bears a faint plum crosshatch in its border. The library's window covers hold uneven hems, thicker on the side closest to morning light. It's like someone wanted to show the color only at sunrise. You start to map them. Not on official paper, too risky. You etch the pattern on wax tablets and memorize the coordinates. Damaris does the same. One afternoon, a secretary from the Ministry of Dried Goods Distribution corners you with a curious look. "I hear you're doing a fabric census," he says. His tone is pleasant. His eyes are not. You nod once. Routine compliance. "Just be careful where you poke," he replies, brushing invisible dust from your shoulder. Some curtains close for a reason. Later that evening, back in your chamber, you turn down the lantern and sit in the quiet. You unfurl one of the secret samples, deep, radiant violet, stolen from behind a treasury couch, and hold it against the pale glow of the moon through your window. Even hidden, it burns. Even silenced, it speaks. And suddenly, you realize something strange. Whoever is behind this, they're winning. The palace is quieter than usual. Not serene, never that, but cautious. There's a hum under the marble. A shared glance between clerks that lingers half a second too long. As if everyone knows something is coming but no one wants to be the first to say it aloud. You arrive at your office to find your door ajar. Inside, a single parchment rests on your desk. Unmarked. Anonymous. You open it. Hall of Maritime Records. Curtain audit. North wall. Sunset. You fold the note and burn it in your oil lamp. Not because you fear being caught, but because you recognize the handwriting. It's the same looped, clean script that marked the first bolt of Forbidden Violet. You arrive early. Wait in a supply alcove. The chamber is long, cool, shadowed. Dozens of curtains line the walls. Drawn shut. You wait. And then, just before the light fails, someone enters. Hooded, quick, efficient. They move to the far wall. Peel back a layer of plain beige linen. And reveal it. An entire undercurtain. Dyed in full imperial purple. Rich, heavy, thrumming in the low light like a heartbeat. You step out. You left the note. They turn. It's not Damaris. It's the same young assistant you saw weeks ago. The one blamed for the navy curtains in the Empress's chamber. She doesn't speak right away. Then, "It's not just me." She unclips the curtain, folds it with reverence. "There's more of us. Tailors, clerks, archivists, even a few in the treasury." "Why?" you ask, quietly. "The law is clear." She looks at you like you've asked why the sun rises. "Because purple still means something. Because they're trying to make us forget what this place was." You help her reclip the outer beige curtain. When she's gone, you linger in the room. You run your hand along the fabric seam, tracing the edge between beige silence and violet memory. And in that moment, you know, the color war was never about thread or dye. It was about control. Control over what people feel when they see a color. Control over legacy. Over pride. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During the final decades before the sack of Constantinople, records show an uptick in unapproved décor, last-minute protocol changes, and fabric errors. Some say it was just mismanagement. Others read it as quiet defiance from a bureaucracy that had grown tired of erasing itself. You and Damaris meet one final time at the fountain. "We're finished," she says. "The beige is taking over." You shake your head. "We've already won. The palace is covered in lies. But the truth's stitched right underneath." She smiles, sad and amused. "That's the most optimistic thing I've ever heard from a curtain auditor." You laugh. "Retired curtain auditor." She raises a brow. You hand her your resignation scroll. "Official. Signed. Effective immediately." "I'm going home," you say, "to a place where the only curtain I care about is whatever keeps the sun out of my eyes when I nap." She hugs you. She smells like ink and old thread. That night, you pack your things. But before you leave, you visit one last chamber, the Hall of Imperial Honors. It's empty, echoing, silent. You kneel by a column and peel back the edge of the nearest drape. It's beige, but behind it? Violet, deep and defiant, untouched. You smile. You find yourself drifting now. The weight of silk and secrets finally loosening from your shoulders. The halls of Constantinople fade into softness, their marbled echoes dulled by time. You picture the curtain swaying, not in tension, but in rhythm with the night breeze. Not watched, not judged, just gently there. The empire will go on a little longer. It always does. People will forget who ordered what curtain, and when, but in the folds, in the seams, in the colors stitched by hands that refused to forget, something will remain. You step outside the palace gates one last time. The moonlight paints the cobblestones in gray. Your tunic is plain, your sandals worn, your bag filled only with the small things that matter. But inside your coat is one final thread, imperial purple, wrapped in quiet paper. You won't hang it, you won't display it, you'll just remember. Now, breathe in, slow and deep. Let the palace slip away. Let the colors fade to dusk. You've done enough. Let the empire keep its curtains. Tonight, you get to rest.